care about. Never mind housing. Anyway, okay, I'll get off my soapbox and say welcome to everybody. And thank you so much for joining us today. Again, put your name in the chat if you feel moved to do so. As you all know, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our democracy, and Secular AZ is your voice for the separation of religion and government. We are a nonprofit organization, and we act as your voice to elected officials all across the state and at every level. So be sure to check out all of our social media channels and like, subscribe, or share. Let's see. Next week, we're not going to be talking to anybody since it's a holiday week, but the following week, we will be speaking with Dr. Barbara Atwood. She is a Mary Ann Ritchie Professor of Law Emerita and co-director of the Family and Juvenile Law Certificate Program at the University of Arizona, James E. Rogers College of Law. And she's going to be joining us to discuss the Arizona abortion ban case and the mifepristone case. So you won't want to miss that. But for next week, we are not going to have a Rage Friday next week. Because for today, I'm really excited. Cait West is our guest today, and she is a writer and editor based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She's the author of Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. Her work has been published in the Revealer, Religion Dispatches, Fourth Genre, and Hawai'i Pacific Review, among others. As an advocate and a survivor of the Christian patriarchy movement, she serves on the editorial board for Tears of Eden, a nonprofit providing resources for survivors of spiritual abuse, and co-hosts the Survivors Discuss podcast. Oh, that is really exciting. I'm definitely going to be checking out your podcast, and I have read most of Cait's book. I definitely recommend it. I'm sure. Oh, good. Lindsay already put it in there. So welcome, Cait. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me today.
And I know you have a so you can I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to you. Cait has asked that we take questions after the presentation. So if you do have questions as they come up, by all means, you can throw them in the chat, and I will monitor the chat, and we'll get to them after the presentation. So go ahead, Cait. I can't wait to see your presentation.
Okay, let me make sure I know how to share. Let's see. Oh, sorry, my system wasn't letting me do it. That's why it's not sharing. Hold on one second.
No worries. While you're getting that set up, I went to Pine Pride event with the Rim Country Pride group, and it was fantastic, and the organizers are amazing, and it was really cool to see a celebration and a safe space for the community up there. So nice job, Rim Country Pride. It was amazing. And we had one protester. Yeah, a 5-inch protester. It's an inside joke. All right, Cait, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Can you see my screen okay? Okay. Well, today I wanted to talk about my book, which is about my life growing up in the Christian patriarchy movement. And I'll go through a little bit of my story and then talk about some of the influences that impacted me and why we believed the way we did and how it's continuing to impact our current state in the US. Because the Christian patriarchy movement is still happening, even though people don't use that term as much as they used to. So this is my book, Rift, and I wrote this because I needed to tell my own story after years of not having a voice. And once I got out, when I was 25 years old, I went to college and started studying writing. And I wanted to just write fiction and pretend nothing bad had ever happened to me. That didn't work out very well. And I felt this need to write down my past. And once I started doing that and I started sharing online, I realized a lot of people could relate, and there were still a lot of people stuck the way I had been stuck. And so my hope is that the book reaches those people who need it, if they relate in any way to spiritual abuse or religious trauma, but specifically women and marginalized people in these high control religious groups. So my story starts out, I was baptized into a Presbyterian church, a conservative Christian family, fairly mainstream, except on the conservative side. And over time, we became more and more radicalized. And so when I was 5.5, my parents pulled me out of kindergarten and said we were going to start homeschooling. And I'm the third of 4 kids. And so I was the first kid that they tried homeschooling out on. And I was told it was for protection, for religious purposes, so that I wouldn't learn evil things. And mind you, I had been going to a Christian school earlier, so it wasn't like I was even in a public school. And I got pulled out. I was homeschooled all the way through 12th grade. And the older I got, the deeper my family got into Christian patriarchy. It started with something called Patriarch Magazine, which is unfortunately, a real magazine. It doesn't exist anymore, but I do have a few copies of those. And what they did was teach men how to be patriarchs. And that meant in their homes, in their churches, and in government. And my father got really into Patriarch Magazine and other kinds of editorials that were big in this movement. And so they were spread throughout the homeschooling world. I felt like it was a grassroots type of sharing. And then there were big leaders that I'll get to later in my slides of the leaders who spread these ideas. And so once I became around 10, my father went to a Vision Forum conference, which I'm not sure if anyone has heard of that before, but it's an organization that promoted Christian patriarchy and this idea of being a stay-at-home daughter. And so that is what I became after I turned 18. I wasn't allowed to leave home or get a job or go to college. I had to wait to get married and become a stay-at-home wife and mother. And that was what I was told was what God wanted for my life. And I didn't have any choices about that. And so it wasn't until I was 25, after 2 courtships, one very long courtship where my dad was very much in control and he ended it. And then a later courtship, which my dad ended after a week. Excuse me. And my dad is a authoritarian type of person. So he has very arbitrary reasons for ending relationships and controlling his family. And so he ended this courtship and I continued to have a relationship with this person. And so if you read the book, you'll hear that story of how I fell in love and eventually moved out of Hawaii, which is where we were living, to be with this person. And he's now my husband. And so it's a story of me leaving everything I had known, my family, my community, the whole ideology of Christian patriarchy, and trying to become an independent woman without any practice. And I moved here to Michigan. I went to college, I got my first job, and I realized that patriarchy hadn't been specific to just my family or my church or even Christianity. And I started noticing patriarchy everywhere, which at my job, at my apartment, where my landlord was discriminating against me versus my husband, it started showing up everywhere. And it was quite the bummer to realize I hadn't escaped patriarchy after all. And so the idea of a rift, it's a very binary concept, right? So there's a before and an after. And my story does have a before and after, but what I'm trying to get at is there is no way to separate myself from my past. The only way I've been able to heal is to integrate what's happened to me and claim that as part of my identity as I move forward. And so the idea of a rift is kind of a false binary metaphor that I work with in the book to explain the layers of who we are as people and what makes us behave the way that we do or believe the way that we do. And so that's in a nutshell what the book is about. And the last chapter, which covers the idea of motherhood and choice. And I was finishing the book when Roe v. Wade was overturned. So I talk a little bit about that at the end of the book. So Christian patriarchy is a belief system where God is masculine. He's called the ultimate or arch patriarch. Um, and that determines the entire theology. So if God is masculine, when he created people, he created man first, Adam, and that meant that men are created in the image of God. Women were created to be helpers to men. And so from their very created being, that's what sets them apart for the rest of the world's history. So because of that, women are never allowed to be leaders, and children are treated as extensions of their parents. So they're not their own people. They don't belong to themselves. They are treated as property of their parents. So I'm sure you've heard of the term parental rights recently, with parents trying to ban books and, um, being on school boards and things like that. And that's where this idea from is that parents have the right to teach their kids whatever they want and control every bit of information that they receive. And that's why, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, religious parents were homeschooling to make sure that they could do that. Another big part of this is that strict gender roles. So there's two genders, a male and female, and you have to follow certain rules to be accepted in the Christian patriarchy community. Men are the leaders, the breadwinners, and women stay home and they rarely have jobs or go to college. And part of that is the idea of quiverful, which, if you are familiar with the Duggar family, that's the ideology that they're known for, is believing that women should have as many children as God gives them. So they don't take birth control, they don't practice any kind of contraception. And that's why we see these very large families who are all homeschooled. And often that means they aren't interacting with adults outside of their family or getting help if there is any kind of abuse going on in the home. I'm sure there'll be questions, so please write them in the chat and we can go back to this too. Okay, a stay-at-home daughter is what I was, and it's a term that's not used as much anymore, but there are still stay-at-home daughters. And I really want to emphasize that because there are a lot of women living like this who don't understand that they have rights as citizens. I was told I wouldn't be an adult until I got married. Even when I turned 18, I did not know that I had any kind of legal rights as an adult because nobody told me that. And I was homeschooled, so I didn't have any information to let me know that I had other options. So being a stay-at-home daughter means you're practicing to be a stay-at-home wife and mother, which usually looks like you're helping your father with whatever he wants you to help him with. That could be like helping him with his laundry or getting his breakfast. Working on a lot of these men like to have home businesses. So I helped my father with his invoices. And because I didn't have a lot of younger siblings, a lot of these families, the older daughters are secondary parents to their younger siblings. So there's a lot of parentification happening. And because I didn't have younger siblings, except for my one younger brother, I was sent out to other families to help them as what we called mother's helpers. So I would go to other families, help them homeschool, help them babysit and cook. And I was occasionally paid very, very low, something like $3 an hour to do this kind of labor as a young adult. I was also not allowed to have any kind of dating relationships. We practiced courtship, which was basically your father helps you find a husband, and you go through this whole courtship process with your father as the mediator and you're chaperoned. There's no one-on-one time until you get married. There is no higher education usually. Occasionally there were girls I knew who would have online classes or might go to a community college close by, but everything that they studied was to help them be a better wife, not to help them pursue their own dreams. And because of that, there is no career. So women aren't allowed to have a boss who's a man. So you're not supposed to serve a man who's not your father or husband. And that's partly why you aren't allowed to have a job and definitely not a career. Um, you don't have many resources or options as a stay-at-home daughter. I was lucky because I had a birth certificate and a social security card. A lot of women who grew up this way don't have those things because the family is anti-government or they want to live off the grid. And so you don't have a way to advocate for yourself. You don't even know you need those things to survive as an adult. And even if you do, you might not have a driver's license or enough understanding of how the outside world works in order to get a job and support yourself if you try to leave. So leaving this lifestyle, extremely difficult. Um, I only know, I think only one or two people who have successfully left this movement as single women. Most people I know have left through getting married in some way, which is my story as well. I left and got married. I don't know how I would have done that financially otherwise. I didn't understand how to live alone either. You're treated as property as a stay-at-home daughter, so you're never called property, but you're treated as under the headship of your father. You belong to him, and he's supposed to preserve your purity until he hands you over to your husband on your wedding day, which is where you belong to your husband at that point. And I would like to point out that I was never taught anything about consent or I really had no sex education. And so marital rape is very common in this community. Um, Again, the Duggar family is something I point to because people recognize that name. If you've seen the documentary Shiny Happy People, you might be familiar with some of these ideas. Which brings me to the Institute and Basic Life Principles, which is what that documentary covers. And I have this umbrella chart here. This is one of the charts that they would use in IBLP to show how the authoritarian structure is supposed to work, where Christ is at the top, below that is the husband, and below that is the wife, and then the children beneath that. And besides the fact they didn't understand how umbrellas work, because clearly that's not how it works to protect yourself from the rain, but it's a good idea of how this hierarchy works. And if you think about that within a church structure, you have all these little miniature cults of patriarchs and their families inside of a church with the pastor at the top. And IBLP started in the 60s with Bill Gothard, who has since not been a part of the organization. It still continues without him, despite the fact that he has been accused of many, many sexual abuse instances. Vision Forum is more of my story. It started in 1998. And in the book, I talk about how my dad went down to San Antonio, Texas to be part of a father-son retreat. And Vision Forum, it was like this homeschooling world that sold all these products. They sold books and movies and toys for kids. And they also had retreats and conferences with big name people in the homeschooling movement. And they also even developed a film festival and a film company. And so they were making films. If you've heard of the movie Fireproof, that was one of the ones that was at the film festival with Kirk Cameron. So all these things, unfortunately, are very connected. So Much More was a book that they published that was about how to be a stay-at-home daughter. And then the tie-in video was The Return of the Daughters, which they called the documentary, but really was a lot of propaganda. Um, Vision Forum ended in 2013, which was the same year I left my family. And that's because Doug Phillips, the leader, was accused of sexual abuse, which I believe is very credible. And after that, the organization basically dissolved. Despite that, they still have a Facebook page for some reason, and I'm not sure entirely who is running that. So this is Doug Phillips from Vision Forum and Bill Gothard from IBLP. And I like to point out the connections that they knew each other. Doug Phillips learned a lot from Bill Gothard, and Vision Forum I think of as a child of IBLP. So now that brings me to, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, and the idea of Christian nationalism spreading across the US. And I just like to point out that Doug Wilson was a huge part of my childhood. My dad would go to Moscow, Idaho to learn from him. I remember picking him up from the airport one time to bring him to a conference on the East Coast. He has a huge empire of media and influence in the US. He started with preaching at Christ Church, which was, he's never been to seminary. So he's not a seminary trained preacher. He just started his own, he started preaching at this new church that had no affiliations and eventually started their own denomination, which is called the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. And they have spread across the US. He also started Logos School, which is a K through 12 Christian school in Idaho. He started Canon Press, which published, I believe, homeschool curriculum. And then also it's printed all of his books and people that he supports, so Christian nationalist books as well. Credenda Agenda was a magazine he used to have. I don't think that runs anymore. And then he also has New St. Andrews College, which I believe his son-in-law is the president of. And then he started this huge association of classical Christian schools, which people don't often know because it's so widespread and they don't always connect his name with that, but he founded that organization. And classical Christian schools are a huge deal. They're very related to homeschooling, but they have like the formal inside of a building type of structure. And so he's been very clear that he thinks Moscow, Idaho should be a Christian town. He recently was on Tucker Carlson, and he seems to be talking more and more to mainstream media the past few years. When I was a kid, it was much more isolated and only talking to Christian groups. And now it seems like he is spreading his ideas to more mainstream outlets, which is interesting to watch. And I'm curious to see what happens there in Moscow. I know there are a lot of people who live there who are very unhappy with how that's going. Another thing I talk about in my book is the Joshua generation. And Michael Ferris started the HSLDA, which is another parental rights organization. It's created a lot of rules that give homeschool families free reign over their children, which has been very harmful in enabling abuse. So he wrote this book about the Joshua generation, which is this idea from the Exodus story where Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt. But because they were sinful in the desert, once they got to the promised land, they couldn't go into the promised land. And God said that they wouldn't be able to go in their lifetime, that their children would go. And their children would be led by a man named Joshua. And so the idea of the Joshua generation is our parents' children, me and my peers, would be raised to take over the promised land. And so it's very this metaphorical language, but really it means training us to be leaders and make America a Christian nation. And so he also started the Generation Joshua organization, which does exactly that. This is a recent case study that I've been interested in. I was recently in Texas and I talked to somebody who has a lot of connections in IBLP and Vision Forum. And she told me about this constitutional attorney there in Texas who he's a leader in these anti-abortion organizations. He helped overturn Roe v. Wade. He was part of that team, but also he grew up Vision Forum, and I heard the story, which I didn't put on here because I can't verify it, but I believe it to be true that he he got married by Doug Phillips. Doug Phillips married him and his wife, but the way he met his wife was he saw her at some event and saw how she was serving. So he went to her father and said, I am interested in marrying your daughter, but I would like you to ask her if she trusts you and don't tell her who I am and if she would agree to marry me without knowing who I am. And I just cringed hearing that because he was testing whether she would be submissive and compliant. And she said yes. They got married 6 weeks later, and they have 11 or 12 children now. And they've only been married like 13 years. And now we're seeing him using his power as an attorney to work against women's rights. And I think that's very telling the way he approached marriage, and how he approaches these issues around women's rights. But he grew up, he's my generation, the Joshua generation. And so it's interesting to me to see that some of us are coming out and speaking against these things, and some of us are doubling down and leading the lives we were trained to lead. Some current trends that I'm seeing with Christian patriarchy are the trad wife movement on TikTok and Instagram. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between satire and reality with these videos, but there are people who really do believe in the trad wife lifestyle, which is just basically a quiverful lifestyle with a new name. I'm sure you've all heard Harrison Butker's commencement speech where he told women that their greatest calling would be to be mothers. And then also we're seeing all over the US different battles in destroying access to abortion, birth control, no-fault divorce, IVF, gender-affirming care, and women's suffrage. And all of these ideas are very familiar to me because I was taught all of those things as a kid, including things like women don't need to vote because if her husband votes differently, they're just canceling each other out. So it's better to have what they call a household vote. And so these patriarchal people want that to happen for the US. If you're interested, I can send the link out for this article I wrote for Newsweek about the trad wife trend if you want to read more about my thoughts on that. And then here's a video I wanted to show you.
We cannot hear the sound, and I
Okay.
betcha it probably has to do with your earbuds being
Oh,
in.
okay.
So perhaps if you, I think, I'm not sure if there's somebody techie here that wants to.
If I play it now without my unplugged my earbuds, do you think you can hear it?
Yes,
Not
maybe.
going to
Yes.
just had to say, hey, I don't know if this is a bad book, but I don't have time to read it. And so you're not going to read it either. We'll read it together. I remember recently my wife had a book and I saw her reading it on the couch. And it was about paedobaptism. And I said, no, we're not doing that yet. We will become paedobaptists when I'm ready. But my wife's not going to be a paedobaptist for 3 years before I am. And I don't have time to read it right now. I know the arguments will be great. I will agree and disagree. I'm not sure which arguments are better, but for the time being, this is what I'm persuaded of, and you're not going to outpace me. And that's not, for the record, that's not lazy. It can be. And you have to be honest with yourself and discerning of your motives, but that's not inherently lazy. This is one of the problems that I remember experiencing early in ministry as a young man with lots of other young men filled with zeal for doctrine, zeal for theology. is that they would go around, they'd be reading something, learning something, listening to something, and they would go around the church. And they'd be talking to every household and every individual in the church about this thing that they've been convicted of for 15 minutes. And they would try to be charitable, and they actually thought this was charitable. And they'd say, well, you don't have to agree with me in my position. I do think it's right, but you don't have to agree with me in the position that I've taken. But you have to have a position. Now, what that's called is tyranny. That's tyranny. Do you know why? You might say, well, they're not dictating the position. This is why it's tyranny. Because what you are doing is you're dictating that person's study habits. You're dictating the very hours in their day. I do that with 4 people. I don't do that with you, and I'm your pastor. It would be tyranny. I do not have that authority. Pastors have a very limited scope of authority outlined specifically in the scripture. I have 4 people in my life that I dictate the hours in their day. I dictate what time they go to the bathroom, when we eat, what we wear. They are my children. Those are the people that I have almost limitless authority with. As just a rule of thumb, a general principle, if you're trying to understand authority, first start with spheres. There are 3 primary spheres that are all forms of government. There is civil government, ecclesiastical, that's the state, ecclesiastical government, that's the church, and familial government. And it is a government. That's the home, the family, households. In these 3 spheres, they are not a hierarchy. It is not the state, then the church, then the household. No, they are 3 spheres that exist autonomously, side by side, and given God's providence in certain practical situations at...
Let me plug my earbuds back in. All right, hopefully you can still hear me.
That was a lot. And I betcha, like, for some people who have been raised in that, it's probably triggering. Like,
Yeah, I should have.
I almost wonder if we should have a trigger warning, because I never went to one of those churches.
Yeah.
But if I had, I'm sure I would have been like, huh.
Yeah, my apologies. I should have I forgot I put that video in there.
Don't
be
worry
honest.
about it. I'm tongue in cheek, but honestly, if it's triggering for me, I guarantee it's triggering for others. Good Lord. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to share that because it's an example of how patriarchal pastors are spreading this message to many, many people in these churches. And it's all part of Christian patriarchy and that idea of authority and hierarchy. Here's some other recommendations if you haven't read or watched these. Jesus and John Wayne, really good book about the history of how we got here with patriarchy and the church and state divide. I felt like it was reading a history of my past because it was just all so familiar. Pure White is a podcast by Sarah Mosliner that covers the history of purity culture. And both of these people, Kristen Dumais and Sarah Mosliner, are experts in this history. So they're very good people to follow and learn from because they've done really deep research into this. I was just listening to the new season of Extremely American, which I don't know how they did this, but they got interviews with Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, and they're interviewing people who live there. So this is very interesting to me. They've only released 2 episodes, so I'm listening to see what they uncover with this podcast. That might be interesting to listen to. Again, I mentioned Shiny Happy People. I also have a podcast with a couple of friends called Survivors Discuss, where we try to have panel discussions with survivors and experts to talk about leaving toxic, high control religion. And we've covered topics like complex PTSD. We have a new episode coming out about the IHOP church, not the IHOP restaurant, the IHOP church abuse story that's developing right now. And so that's a good podcast, hopefully, that people can learn from. And then I'm also a volunteer for Tears of Eden, which is a nonprofit that supports survivors of spiritual abuse. You can join a virtual support group. You can read our blog. We have lots of resources. And it's focused on people within or without, or who have left the evangelical community. And this is my information. I wanted to offer you all a discount for my book. If you'd like to send me a Venmo, I can personalize it however you'd like and mail it to you with free shipping. So that's my Venmo name and QR code. And I'm also on social media. Check out my website, caitwest.com, for events. I've been doing events this summer, which have been really great to be in person with people. And then also I have a newsletter on Substack. So yeah, that is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening to all of that.
Wow. Really great. There's a lot going on in the chat. I know all of
Okay.
us, we are a bit cheeky. We've kind of started calling these oh, and you know what? You can go ahead. Yeah, leave that up for just a little bit.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
No, I think if people got it, and if you're willing to maybe even just share that one page so we can share it with everybody who's here today, we can do that too.
Oh yeah, I can definitely do that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let me go back to some of the questions that we have here. Yeah, we're a bit cheeky. We call this Rage Friday because we have folks talking about the patriarchy, and that makes me mad. So it makes a lot of other people mad too. Oh wow, I'm now just seeing everybody's hellos. Look, there's so many great people here. Hi, everybody who is here. There was a question that I saw come in early from Mars, and they were asking about is your book is it available through audio book?
Yes, there
Okay.
is a hardcover ebook and audio. I read the audiobook, and you can get that on Audible.
Okay. They're looking at, I know that Mars is a big supporter of their public library, so I guess it's probably just a matter of time before the Phoenix Public Library gets it.
Yeah, you can request at your library that they can have it in.
Mm-hmm. And I do know that nowadays with ebooks and audiobooks and stuff like that, a lot of libraries will let you have a membership to their library to be able to check out books virtually. So perhaps. All right, let's see. Ian said patriarchy is in the room with us right now. It's true. Let's see. God does have preferred pronouns for sure. He goes by he. Although, wait, but then there's also like in Catholicism, it's, Mary, whatever. I don't know. I think they might be they, them as well. Who knows? My heart is breaking right now, for sure. I think that was the same part when you were talking about how you were 25 years old. So for me, reading your book, I mean, I feel like I have a pretty solid grasp of purity culture, quiverful, all these various, Christian sects that impose this kind of patriarchal, authoritarian patriarchy on their, congregants. But the 25 years old thing really blew my mind, but it makes sense, right? If you were homeschooled pretty much your whole entire education and you'd never seen an example, well, you had, didn't your sister try to leave? So the examples that you had seen were like, that doesn't go well when you try to
Right.
defy the father and the family, right?
Right. I have two older siblings. My older sister almost eloped one day. And I remember writing a eulogy to her because I was told I would never see her again. And she came back, she repented, and she was also a stay-at-home daughter till she was in her mid-20s after that. But she did try to leave, and it was a really bad situation. My older brother, he joined the army when he was 17, so he was like, I'm out as soon as possible.
Yeah. And I imagine that's like for a lot of these children, that is probably and just one of the way, like, okay, I know that I can do this at the age of 18 and just get the heck out of here. And I can't
Right.
even, like, can you imagine too, like, where was your brother stationed when he joined the military? That's what I want to know, because everything to your brother had to have been completely foreign.
Yeah, and he left right before we got involved in Vision Forum. So he didn't see all of the deep Christian patriarchy stuff that became escalated. And we lost contact with him for a few years because, he wasn't belonging. He was the prodigal son. And so I saw that and I was like, I'm not going to leave either because I will never see my family again.
And I mean, and you don't really go into much detail, I guess. Well, you do a little bit about like your older sister. To me, reading your book, I felt like she was a firecracker, like she was feisty. And I feel, and then as time went on, and then she did
Mhm.
end up getting married and everything. I just feel like they stole the fire from her, you know?
Yeah, that's how I felt too, watching her go through all of that. And then she got married to someone who was just like my dad. It was really hard to watch her go through all of that. And I didn't write a lot about her story because of the abuse of each of us kids experienced. I don't want to overshare. Um, but she got divorced from her abusive husband, and she has been thriving ever since. So she
Oh,
also got out. So I just want to give people that reassurance. She's back to her feisty self.
oh, good. That makes me so happy. That was like, like I think you talk about like listening to secular music or whatever. Like, she would figure out a way to kind of be
Hmm.
that rebellious teenager. Okay, now I have to ask real quick. Have you watched Welcome to Plathville?
I have not. I've seen clips and it's a
Okay.
lot.
It's probably triggering for you, you know what I mean? But for
Yeah.
me, I find it completely fascinating, and it's to me a really compelling story because you have these, fundamentalists and kind of quiverful family, and watching them deconstruct in real time on reality television to me is fascinating. But I bet for a lot of
Yeah.
people who were raised that way, it would be very triggering.
Yeah,
Um,
because my dad would watch the Duggars as a like, oh, this is a great family story. So for me, it was not like it was too close to home. So I haven't
yeah.
seen that.
I can appreciate all of that. I know Matt, I don't know if Matt's still here, but there was that docuseries on Netflix called The Group, which was
Hmm.
about like these bad teenagers, and like back in the 90s and 2000s, they would send these like, rebellious teenagers to these camps, and come to find out the whole thing was created by a Mormon guy, of course, and it's very abusive, and they're taking the parents' money and telling them that they're gonna, just bend their will, and the
Mhm.
abuse that took place in these spaces. And so when I talked about it to Matt, he was like, "Oh yeah, I went to one of those places." I was like, "You did?" And I said, "Maybe you shouldn't watch this then, because it's very, very graphic in the things that
Mhm.
happen." Okay, here we go. So this is the question from Philip. He asks, do we have any data that sheds light on how many people or families in the United States have adopted this Christian patriarchy lifestyle? So there's the first part of the question. And the second part is also, is it more prevalent in the US than in other countries?
This is the difficult thing about getting data is because by nature, a lot of these people are anti-government, right? They're not going to go submit a survey or be studied for research. So we don't have good numbers on how many people are in this. And also, it's more of a movement instead of like a group. So because there's no centralized structure, people might believe these things and be in so many different kinds of churches. And in the beginning of my book, I talk about how this is across many denominations, Protestant denominations, but now I'm seeing it's also, now that I've learned more, it's also in Roman Catholic, the Roman Catholic Church as well. And so I think it's really difficult to get good numbers. One clue I have is that homeschooling has grown exponentially in the past few years. And I know part of that is the pandemic, but most of the curriculum out there is based on Christian nationalist beliefs. So that's troubling to me. And I've been looking into other communities like the Amish and Mennonite communities, writing about that. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who live the plain lifestyle in these closed communities. And they also are not tracked very well, right? Because they aren't part of the mainstream society. So we really don't have good numbers, but there are many people. Um, and that's my understanding of the US. I know Canada would be included in that as well. Um, but I've been hearing from people in other countries like Germany and South Africa. I don't think it's as prevalent there, but I mean, extremism is everywhere. This particular brand of it, I'm not sure how widespread it is.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, this is a great question. Cait, you may have already mentioned this, but maybe I missed it. What are your current religious views and how did you arrive at them? I mean, if that's not too personal of a question.
No, that's totally fine. In my book, I talk about, I started with this very patriarchal God, and then I leave that and I still want to go to church. And eventually I leave church. And for me, it just stopped making sense. Organized religion just stopped making sense for me. And a lot of the people I work with in the survivor community, they hold on to their faith as a tool of healing. And that just wasn't my story. So I want to respect anybody who's leaving toxic religion can still have a spirituality that works for them. So me, I'm pretty agnostic these days. I just want people to be happy and not oppressed.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly reasonable thing to want. Yeah, you may you may consider the American Humanist Association too. They have an annual conference and there's a lot of
Okay,
humanist organizations around. We have one here called the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix. And they have speakers and or like, I know that a lot of we even have a board member who attends a Unitarian Universalist church, where you can find that
great.
kind
Yeah.
of inclusive space. Yeah. Let's see. Annika says, I have an aunt who grew up Mennonite. Can you say more?
Yeah, and I'm still learning about this because I was taught a very limited version of what Amish and Mennonite people, how they live. And then we also have a lot of the evangelical cultural appropriation of that, right? The Amish romance novels are all evangelical usually.
Yes, yeah.
Um, and so there are lots of different communities within the Anabaptist faith, and they have lots of different rules. And so one community is going to be different from another. I've been talking with a couple survivors to write a piece about the tourism industry, and
Mhm.
it's very troubling to see how the leaders in these Anabaptist churches are using money and isolation as leverage to abuse people. There's extremely high child sex abuse statistics coming out of these communities.
Mm. Shocking. I think the movie was called The Women, and they never came right out and said that we are. And they have Frances McDormand. I remember that.
Oh, Women Talking.
Women
Yeah, Women
Talking.
Talking. Mhm,
Yes, great, great film. Frances McDormand too is just one of my favorite actresses.
mhm.
That's a whole other thing. It's not something that I was thinking about, but just saying that, like, you also talk about how, once you did finally get out and how you'd like, it's like those water cooler moments, right? Where like people would be talking about pop culture things and you're like, uh-huh, that's so funny. I have no idea what you're talking about. How long did it take? Or are you grateful? I mean, I wonder if you're even grateful. Look at all the books behind you, but like, there are possibly some good aspects, right? Like, you don't have as much screen time. Maybe you don't partake in habits that are detrimental to your health, right? But like, imaginative play instead of just handing a child a phone. There has to be maybe some positives. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can live like it's kind of like how people convert into being Mennonites. Like a lot of times they just really like, I'm learning that they just like the homesteading lifestyle. And that's great. Like you can go do that. You don't have to convert to a whole high control religion to enjoy those things. I'm not against homeschooling as a form of education. I just think there needs to be safer ways to do it. I didn't mention the Coalition for Responsible Home Education is a great nonprofit to follow because they're working on legislation to actually protect homeschooled kids. But yeah, there's definitely positive things. Like I was out in nature all the time, um, but a lot of negative things, and I think like any kind of childhood experience, it's a mix of good and bad.
Hmm. Is that organization, the Responsible Homeschool, is R.L. Stoller part of that?
I don't know if he's officially part of that. He started Homeschoolers Anonymous back in the day, and this is kind of like a shift from that. It's more of a nonprofit that's working on legislation.
It's funny because I've talked to people who have been in your situation and RL's situation, and it's like this just immense gratitude and joy when you like find each other,
Mhm.
like that's got to be a really kind of magical experience to like find your people after all of that
Yeah,
brainwashing, oppression.
Yeah, and you learn to build communities in other ways that aren't hierarchical and like toxic. So it's
Mhm.
been lovely to meet people through this whole book experience too.
And your experiences are so specific too. I imagine that like when you all get, it's like when this one's for you, Ian, when a bunch of Star Wars nerds get together and they're like, I know this character and that scene and this particular like whatever of the universe. And you all are probably like, oh yeah, that happened to me. You know what I mean? So a few things from your book. One question that I did have, you didn't mention it, but I know a lot of these religious sects practice the whole purity ball thing. Did you ever have a purity ball?
I knew of them, but I didn't actually ever go to one. My church was more, we lived in the mountains, I'll just say. Like we lived in the mountains in Colorado. It was difficult to drive anywhere, so I didn't see people a lot. If you think about the book Educated, it was kind of like that disconnection. We did have a Civil War ball though for the homeschooling association in Colorado, where we dressed up, we made our own Civil War dresses and learned how to dance the Virginia Reel. So
And according to your book too, your dad was a big fan of the South, right?
mhm.
So
He
that
calls himself a Southern sympathizer. And so, it wasn't until I left that I realized how much white supremacy I was being taught. It was just my normal, and so I've had to like really research and learn a lot about all the things I was told.
I can only imagine. It was probably back in maybe 2021. I went to the FFRF conference, and it was one of the daughters of Fred Phelps, the God hates F word guy, the Westboro Baptist Church guy.
Hmm.
And so she was one of the children that escaped from that cult.
Yeah.
And she was so, you could just feel her excitement about like all the things that she's been able to learn since leaving.
Hmm.
Yeah. So let's see. There were a few things that you said that I think about all the time, and it also makes me think about how you said, you got out of the church and there's patriarchy there, and then you got, or you were in the church and there's patriarchy. You got out and you're like, oh, look, more patriarchy. But like just little things that we say, when boys tease
Hmm.
you, that means they like you, and all of the different little like I don't know if they're microaggressions, but like the little things that we say, boys will be boys. It's locker room talk. If he hits you, it means he likes you. It's setting us all up
Yeah.
for the patriarchy at our own detriment. Um, yeah, and one of the things I wrote it down again, I said I didn't know if my notes would make sense later, but just you mentally adding more rules to the mental list that you had in your head of the things you're allowed to do and the things that you're not allowed to do. It had to have just been so overwhelming. Like the term walking on eggshells comes to
Hmm.
mind. Oh my gosh, the other thing that struck me too was when your pen pal. Like so in the book, Cait talks about how, one of the ways to be able to connect with others was through like this, Christian pen pal thing, right? And how when your pen pal was like, I'm feeling suicidal, your father was like, don't talk to them ever again.
Hmm.
Did he explain that in a biblical way? Or was it just more like these are evil influences and he doesn't want you to be near that? Like the compassion piece for me.
Suicide was a very great sin. And so anyone who did that would have been just completely judged. Um, and so he didn't explain it in that moment that I remember. I just was scared. I didn't know how to deal with it. I was a kid. And I also experienced I started experiencing those fears myself. And I didn't know how to talk to my parents about that. And so it's one of my biggest regrets is that I've lost contact with her. Um, because he didn't think I should be friends with her anymore. And so it taught me what I would be treated like if I came forward about my own mental health too.
Boy, God, what a thing to consider. Um, so I don't, it appears to me as if you don't really talk to your dad anymore.
Right. Yeah. We probably haven't gotten that part in the book,
I
but I'm
didn't get all the
no
way through, but
contact.
I do remember though, like you went to visit and like and you're still able to kind of compartmentalize the positive memories that you do have about your dad. You know, like you went, I don't remember if you went fishing or you went somewhere in nature, but what you remember was Rush Limbaugh on the radio. Like he insisted on having the radio with Rush Limbaugh on. So it's kind of interesting that even in those moments he needed to,
Mhm.
you know. Um, so you don't talk to them, but so how do they reconcile Trump? How do they reconcile, you know, with all of their purity culture nonsense, with all of their, I mean, I guess maybe they think, well, it's the women's fault for tempting him. How do they?
This is something I struggle with, right? So I think a lot of people my age are leaving the church because of this very issue, because we were taught one thing about this, and then it seems like people are just like separating that somehow from the idea of voting for Trump. And part of that is that that story of him being this manly figure, right, who's going to turn the country around. And he's proven that he can get Roe v. Wade overturned. And so sometimes that just clouds everything else, as long as abortion is the issue. I don't have I don't know how a way to explain that in like a couple minutes. It's just such a very complicated way of thinking. Um, but if you've been in these churches, you know men very much like Trump. And maybe who are more careful about hiding their sins or crimes. But yeah, I know a lot of men who are narcissists leading these churches.
It's
And
a
I just
big
want
one.
to say, I I want to give hope too, you know, because it's difficult to like dig into these topics. And the debate last night, I'm just like, and then the Supreme Court decisions that are coming out, I'm just like, you know, panic mode in my mind. But I want to remind myself and other people that change is possible. Like this is not the ending. I was able to change. I was raised to be a white supremacist, and I was able to find a way out. And I know a lot of people who have. And so what helped me was people asking me questions and treating me with respect and kindness, and just asking me why I believed certain things and not judging me outright, and just helping me understand their perspective. And so I think the more we have conversations, it can help. I know it seems maybe irreversible at this point in some ways, the way our government is going, but I do have hope that we can work together to make it better.
Well, and it's funny because I end every discussion about what gives you hope,
Oh, sorry.
and that's great.
Just jumped to
No,
it.
no, I love it. No, it's perfect, you know. So here's one more question that I want to get to because it's important. Mars is asking, how can we save more women and children from these kinds of situations?
Um, like I said, reach out if you notice somebody, they're your neighbors. They're not living on communes usually. Say hello, you know, ask questions, be kind. You don't have to evangelize them because they're not going to listen to that anyways. Um, Spreading information, just if this is, you know, telling your story, I found that just telling my story has gotten a lot of responses from people still stuck in situations, and they're trying to find a way out. And so just sharing this information on the internet's a really powerful tool. Social media, it has its negatives, but it's really powerful in getting to people who are isolated. And so the things that you share, the things you talk about really do make a difference. It made a difference to me when I got the internet, when I still lived with my parents, was one of the reasons I got out. And so I think keep spreading information, be kind, ask questions, show people that they have agency in their lives.
Right on. So I appreciate you so much. Again, the book is Rift, by Cait West. It is really great. I've got to think maybe like 30 more pages left to go. Get your hands on it. And she gave a special offer. So please be sure to share that so we can make
Yeah.
sure that if anybody here wants to buy the book, then they'll have the special offer code.
Can you just
Um,
like email it out for me, or can I send it to you some way?
If you've given us permission, then yeah, we
Okay.
can follow up with that. So,
Okay.
right on. Okay. Thank you so much, Cait West. I appreciate you. Book is great. Everybody should read it. And I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. It is, I'm sorry, Matt, I just saw it. It's like near McCormick Ranch, the event tonight. So have a great weekend. Thanks again, Cait West. And we'll
Thank
see you
you.
all in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thanks.